Welcome to Tigray Television. I'm Mary Iman. I'll be reading the news for you today. Stay tuned. A member of Tigray State Council and high-level member of the opposition party, the National Congress for Great Tigray, or Baitona, has been detained by Ethiopian authorities in Addis Ababa. Kebron Berha was taken from his residence to Kaliti Penitentiary in the outskirts of the capital and is yet to be brought before the court of law, nor has his family members been informed as to why he has been taken into custody. Kebron had recently published a book revolving around the war on Tigray. Kebron had been detained in Afar for more than 3 months following the Ethiopian government's declaration of state of emergency in October of last year, when thousands of Tigrayans were confirmed to have been ethnically profiled and held in internment camps across the country. Women and girls in Tigray have been subjected to extreme sexual violence that included gang rape, sexual slavery, and violence leading to multiple health complications, including fistula. Our reporters visited Ma'ala Hamlin Fistula Center and spoke with multiple women, including one survivor of sexual violence, who even a year later is still suffering from physical wounds due to the blockade that has made it impossible to access sufficient medical care. Salome Tchalai presents.
For much of the world, obstetric fistula is an academic rarity, and 2 years ago, before the start of the war on Tigray, it was on its way to being eradicated in Tigray as well. But 2 years later, following the systematic destruction of health facilities across the region, the Fistula Center has once again become overwhelmed by women suffering from the condition. Another factor in exacerbating the number of fistula cases in Tigray has been the widespread use of sexual violence.
I begged them to leave me be, and they responded by saying, "Shut up, you agama." They raped me after I had just given birth. It was 2 Eritrean soldiers. They took turns raping me. 3 days later, I realized I couldn't control my urine. I only had 1 child, and they killed him.
Another patient we met at the center says that because medical facilities in her village were destroyed, she had to give birth in her house. Her labor lasted 5 whole days, after which she was no longer able to control her urine.
I was home during labor. It lasted for 5 days. I couldn't go to a hospital. I gave birth at home. I couldn't control my legs. They would just lean to one side. I couldn't control my bowel movement after that.
Even after a year of the traumatic incident that left these women incontinent, both are yet to heal, as medical treatment remains out of reach.
I'm in a terrible situation. I can't control my urine. I feel a horrible pain in my uterus as well.
Medical Director of Hamlin Fistula Center, Dr. Malako Abraha, and coordinating nurse Azib Kalayu on their part say that the center is on the verge of collapsing due to the blockade on all essential items, including medical supplies.
ናይ ምግቢ ናይ ጽሬት ናይ ሕክምና መሳርሒ መመርመሪታት እውን በተዘሎ ከባን እጽዋን
We haven't been able to provide food or food sanitation materials as well as items necessary for diagnostic because of the siege. We are on the verge of closing our doors.
ሓደ ዓመት ሙሉ ምንም ነገር የብሉ ካብና ሰራሕተኛ ደሞዝ ጀሚሩ ማለት እዩ ለተንሕሙማት ለብጀተለን በጀት ምንም ነገር የለም.
The center hasn't had anything for a year now. Since last June, we haven't had salary for staff or a budget for the patients. We're reaching a point where we can no longer provide care for those desperate women.
This facility, the only one treating women with fistula cases in Tigray, just like all of Tigray's health system, has been exhausted by the ongoing siege, prolonging the suffering of these women and their families.
The circumstance of the more than 2 million IDPs in Tigray that have been forced to leave their homes in light of grave violations of human rights and the blockade on basic services has been exacerbated by the almost year-long siege on the region. Our reporter Winta Kidana met with Abdullah Ali, a 75-year-old IDP displaced from Maikadra. He says he was separated from his wife and his 8 children while trying to get his other son medical treatment after he was shot and wounded by forces from the Amhara region. Now, more than a year and a half later, his son has passed away. Like the all IDPs, Abdullah is starving and has no access to medical treatment. And equally painful is that he has not been able to reach out to his family for over a year now.
Abdullah Ali is 75 years old and sheltered in an IDP camp in Maqala.
He says he left his home in Maikadra when Fano, a paramilitary group from Amhara region, started to commit atrocities in the area.
Fano just started killing people randomly. There was no reason behind their actions. They were just shooting at Tigranis. My son was shot on his knees, and so I had to take him to the hospital. That's how I became separated from the rest of my family. My wife and my 8 other children ran away to Sudan, while my son and I went to Adwa for medical treatment.
After their arrival in Adwa, Abdullah said he and his son had to stay in Adwa hospital for 3 months, but later his son was referred to Maqala.
I stayed at Adwa hospital for 3 months, but we had nothing to eat. Residents used to give us food. Then they referred my son to Eider hospital here in Mekelle. My son was diabetic in addition to his wound. He passed away 6 months later on June 29 of last year.
After his loss, Abdullah went to a shelter in Libanus College, a temporary IDP camp in Maqala, and was later transferred to Sawakari IDP camp. Abdullah suffers to diabetes, a condition for which he has not been able to get medical treatment.
I have been diabetic for almost 30 years now. I used to have medical follow-ups and take medication. I used to have regular diet suitable for my condition, like red tape, sorghum, and milk. I have been here for 7 months now, and I am yet to see a doctor, but what really likely to kill me is the lack of food.
Abdullah says the hunger often forces him to consume foods that are not suitable for people with his condition, and over time, this has deteriorated his health to a degree where he is no longer able to leave his bed.
Medication is not always available, but I get medicine now and then. But there is never food. With my health condition, it's not like I can eat whatever I can manage to find. If I eat bread or anything made of wheat, my whole body swells up. I eat that salad with injera and it's made me weak and bedridden.
Abdullah says being unable to communicate with his family members has been as painful as his conditions. It has been over a year now since he's spoken to his children and family and asks us to pass along this message to them.
I heard that people go to border areas to make phone calls, but I cannot do that. I don't have the money for transportation. I'm sure my children are worried about me. My children, how are you? My son Ali, how are you? My daughters Hayat, Jamia, Hawa, how are you? I'm fine, though I sometimes get ill. I miss you. I cannot meet you due to the blockade because the roads are blocked.
Away from his family and with no one to offer help, Abdullah is living in a plastic room at the camp, one that is on the verge of collapsing due to the ongoing siege.
Rain is a big problem now. The tent is flooded with water coming in through the walls and the roof. We sit in the middle when it rains. I cannot even start to explain the cold here. We are all suffering since the start of the winter. The aid organizations are just delivering pots and cups, but what we really need are blankets.
The ethnic cleansing campaign in western Tigray has devastated families, left more than 1 million displaced and homeless. While the siege is working to ensure that they cannot access medical treatment or food aid, the question now is when and if the world will act to protect the millions on the brink.
The horrific violence committed against Tigrayans by Ethiopian forces and their allies from Eritrea has left hundreds of thousands dead, millions displaced, and many scared. Our reporters traveled to Adyargudi in central Tigray and spoke with a family that lost their home and their loved ones when the Eritrean forces invaded their village in November of 2020. Saron Tigray reports.
Ta'ban Nuru, 76, was a resident of Adyargudi, a small vicinity in Imbasaneti in central Tigray. Eritrean forces were the first to enter the village, she says, spreading chaos and fear wherever they went. On November 23 of 2020, the Eritreans started to attack civilians in Adyargudi, forcing residents to leave their homes to hide in the wilderness. Her only living son, Mas'ud, grabbed her from her home, took her to a hiding place, and left to collect his cattle. This would be the last time Ta'ba would see her son.
He was the only one left of my 5 children, and the Eritrean troops took him from me. Prior to his death, he was trying to hide me away so Eritrean soldiers wouldn't find me and kill me. He took me to the wilderness. He told me to stay put until he collects his cattle. He covered me with a blanket and left. I told him not to go, but he told me he would be back. I wish they would have killed me instead.
Ta'ba waited for days for her son to come back and take her home. 10 days later, family members would find her, take her home, and tell her what had happened to her son.
I waited for a whole day there, but he didn't come back. At dusk, I went out of my hideout and started asking people who were passing by if they saw my son. They all told me they didn't see him. I spent the night there. In the morning, I asked a man if he knew where my son was. He told me he might have gone to another area. I told myself that he wouldn't leave without me and kept asking. They all kept telling me they didn't see him. I waited for 10 days there. He never made it back. My daughter-in-law and the neighbors found me and took me home. They told me that my son had been killed.
Amina Adam, Ta'ba's daughter-in-law, says her and her husband were separated while trying to escape Eritrean soldiers. Amina searched for her husband for 9 days before she finally found his dead body besides that of slaughtered animals.
He was a farmer. He was with his cattle when they killed him. They first slaughtered 10 goats and an ox, and then they killed him there.
Amina was pregnant when she lost her husband and was hiding in the wilderness. When she finally returned home, she realized the soldiers had camped there, taking everything they could find. Amina had come to realization that she had not only lost her husband, but also the home that they had shared together.
For 9 days, while we were out in the wilderness, Eritrean troops were camping in our house. They used up everything while they were there and stole whatever was left when they left. I was pregnant at the time. I came back to an empty house and had nothing to feed my children.
Masoud was not the only loved one Amina lost. Her father would be taken at the hands of Ethiopian forces in January of 2021.
First, they killed my husband, and then they killed my father. My father was killed by Ethiopian soldiers. He was 88 years old, and he was too old to leave the house. That's where they killed him. We were forbidden from burying his body, so we buried him at night, when the soldiers wouldn't see us.
Amina, a single mother of 8, is now forced to take care of her children and her mother-in-law, alone with no salary or help in sight.
The termination of basic services and the all-encompassing siege that has blocked basics from entering Tigray have devastated millions. We visited the home of Jamila Muhammad, a mother of 4 whose husband suffers from disability. Jamila says it's been very difficult for her and her children, and especially her son, who's in addition to other health complications, is now suffering from malnutrition. Aragawi Gabra Mikhail has more.
Jamila Muhammad is the mother of 4 children, living here in Makali. She was a full-time mother caring for her children before the start of the war on Tigray. For a year now, her husband, who suffers from disability and other health conditions, have found it nearly impossible to support their children. She says her family is going hungry every day. One of her children, Abdul Jamal, is now suffering from malnutrition. And Jamila tells she is unable to find him medical care.
He is sick. He has trouble breathing, and his nose is clogged. I took him to the clinic, but I couldn't get any medication there, so they told me to buy him medicine from a private pharmacy. People at the hospital helped me buy the medication. I had nothing at hand. My son's health had improved after he took the medicine, but now he's becoming ill again, and he's also suffering from malnutrition.
Jamal Hussein is Jamila's husband. He suffers from physical disability and also epilepsy, for which he needs medication. But since the start of the siege on Tigray, Jamal has not been able to access medication, making it difficult for him to support his wife in this difficult time.
In addition to my physical disability, I am also suffering from epilepsy, and I have to take medication every night. The doctors advised me to take my medication after a meal and to drink a lot of water, but I have nothing to eat, so I just take my medication. I take on an empty stomach and hope for God's mercy.
Jamila says her children's suffering causes her a lot of pain. She says going to the hospital to find that there was nothing doctors could do to help her children and become exhausting.
What's most difficult is the case of my children. They're okay when they have something to eat, but if they're hungry, they become difficult and I become stressed.
The story of Jamila and her family is the story of millions of families across Tigray that are suffering due to the lack of access to vital services, medication and food aid, a basic right, weaponized by the Ethiopian government.
And with that, we're going to wrap up our news for the hour. I'm Mary from Tigrai. Thank you for tuning in.